The wind coming off the Welsh coast carried a sharp, metallic chill that morning, the kind that seeped into windowsills and clung to the damp pavements of Port Talbot like a lingering warning. Even decades after the heat of the steelworks had dimmed and the roar of machinery faded, the town still felt shaped by fire and smoke, as if its people carried the weight of every shift worked and every night survived. But beneath the industrial grit and the weary rhythm of ordinary lives was another weight, an older, darker one. It was the weight of a crime that had haunted the community for half a century, a crime whispered about in pubs and kitchens, a crime that had never been answered. Detective Inspector Paul Burrows had lived with the shadow of that story for most of his life. Growing up, he'd heard fragments of it, 2 girls gone missing after a night out, their bodies found in woodland, the fear that swept through the region, the name, Saturday Night Strangler, muttered with dread. Adults never said much around children, but they didn't need to. The fear settled in the air, becoming part of the town's identity. Now, decades later, Paul found himself standing in a cold case review room surrounded by boxes marked 1973, and he felt the same heaviness he had as a boy hearing about it for the first time. The room was cluttered with old binders, photographs faded at the edges, statements typed on yellowing pages, and evidence bags sealed so long ago the plastic had stiffened. Across the table, Detective Phil Reese, older, grayer but still sharp, studied a photo of the 2 victims. Geraldine Hughes, 18, smiling with a softness that made the brutality of her death even harder to bear, and Pauline Floyd, also 18, with bright eyes and the kind of youthful confidence that expected the world to be kind, not cruel. They had been out at the top-ranked nightclub in Swansea on the evening of September 16, 1973. They had left together. They were never seen alive again. Paul dropped into the chair opposite Phil, the file heavy in his hands. "You've lived this case longer than anyone," he said quietly. Phil didn't look up. "Lived it, breathed it, hated it. We were sure we'd find him back then, but we didn't. And those girls," he trailed off, shaking his head. "You think we can do it now?" Paul asked. Phil finally lifted his eyes. "DNA solved cases colder than this, advances we never could have imagined back then. It's our best chance." Paul nodded, though the weight of expectation pressed hard against his chest. DNA had become the backbone of modern forensic investigation, able to identify killers from microscopic traces, able to solve crimes decades old, but only if the evidence had survived. Only if someone had done their job right in 1973. Only if chance favored the dead for once. The weather outside turned harsher, beating against the windows. Inside, the detectives began their slow journey back in time. The original case file was a brutal read. On that September night, Geraldine and Pauline had been in good spirits, dancing and laughing beneath colored lights that flickered across the packed club floor. Top Rank had been the place to be then, a pulsing, living space where the youth of Swansea came to escape work, obligations, and the monotony of small-town life. The 2 girls left around 11:45 p.m., seen by several witnesses walking toward the taxi queue. No taxi driver ever reported picking them up. Instead, the last sighting placed them near the dual carriageway, possibly accepting a lift. That detail, ambiguous and frustrating, had shaped every theory from the start. Their bodies were found the next day in a remote area of Llandarcy, about 20 miles from Swansea. They had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Their clothing was disturbed, their hair matted with leaves and soil, and the cold autumn air had stiffened their limbs by the time the first officer arrived. The scene was chaotic, partly because local officers weren't prepared for a crime this severe, partly because the media descended quickly, and partly because the world of modern forensics simply didn't exist yet. Back then, the idea of using DNA to catch a killer was science fiction. Now, in the cold case room, the detectives were determined to undo decades of stagnation. For days, they combed through every sheet of paper, every outdated lead, every witness statement taken in a rush half a century earlier. They worked quietly, methodically, often exchanging only short comments and long sighs. The work was tedious, but behind every page was a human story. A mother who never recovered, a community that lived in fear, officers who felt they had failed. On the fourth day, Phil carefully lifted a brittle evidence bag from the bottom of one of the boxes. Inside was the victim's clothing, sealed, labeled, untouched since the last recorded examination in the 1980s. "If anything survived," he whispered, "it'll be in here." Paul handled the bag as if it were a fragile relic. Modern DNA profiling could extract genetic traces from the smallest biological remnants, hair, sweat, skin cells. But the 1973 evidence had been handled by dozens of people, sometimes without gloves, sometimes in open air. Contamination was almost guaranteed. Even so, the possibility remained, just enough to push them forward. They sent the samples to the forensic lab with detailed preservation requests. The waiting began. In the meantime, the team deepened their understanding of the world the victims lived in. 1970s Wales was a place of industrial pride but economic struggle, where people worked hard and sought joy wherever they could find it. Geraldine and Pauline had been typical teenagers, working low-wage jobs, saving money, dreaming of futures they never got to see. Friends described them as inseparable, always looking out for one another. They were smart, careful, responsible. The idea that they would willingly enter danger didn't make sense. But detectives knew then, and now, that predators exploited trust, darkness, and vulnerability. A lift offered by a stranger, a friendly face in a car, a moment of hesitation, that's all it took. Paul kept the girls' photos pinned above his desk. The past had faces, not just paperwork. Late one evening, while reviewing a list of suspects from 1973, Paul paused at a name he didn't immediately recognize: Joseph Kappen. There was only a brief mention of him in the old file, a note that he had been interviewed early in the investigation. He had been a nightclub regular, owned a vehicle matching the description of one seen near the girls, and had a criminal history involving violence and assaults. But for reasons lost to time, he was dismissed as a serious suspect. No one could remember why. There was no follow-up interview, no formal ruling out, just a faint line of ink under his name and the word unremarkable. But some details. Age 29. Occupation, bus driver. Known for aggression. History of offenses against women. Lived near the area. Paul tapped the page thoughtfully. "Why did they drop him?" he muttered. Phil walked over. "Who?" "Joseph Kappen." Phil frowned, scanning the entry. "I remember that name vaguely. Local troublemaker. He died back in 1990, if I'm not mistaken." "Dead suspects are easier to blame," Paul said, "but that doesn't make them guilty." Phil nodded. "True, but the profile fits." "For now," Paul replied. He didn't like coincidences. Coincidences led to lazy conclusions. What mattered was evidence, something solid enough to stand after 50 years. Still, the name lingered in his mind like a loose thread begging to be pulled. The forensic report arrived 3 weeks later. The envelope was thick and marked urgent DNA findings. Paul closed his office door before opening it, feeling the thump of his heartbeat in his ears. Phil leaned against the wall, arms folded, his expression attempting calm but revealing a quiet desperation. Inside, the report laid out the results. Several DNA profiles had been recovered from the victim's clothing. Some were modern, lab technicians, earlier investigators. But one profile, faint yet distinct, did not match any files from contamination logs. One male profile. One unknown individual. The lab concluded, suitable for partial comparison. It was the first break in 50 years. But a partial DNA profile alone was useless, unless they had something to compare it to. They didn't. Or so Paul thought. Phil pointed to the name at the bottom of the page, an analyst's note. profile consistent with mixed ancestry, typical of individuals from the Kappen family line, previously sampled in unrelated cases. Paul froze. Kappen. Family line, Phil repeated. That doesn't mean Joseph specifically. But he's dead, Paul said. We don't have his DNA. Not yet, Phil corrected. They exchanged a long look. The evidence was whispering a name from the grave. Finding a dead man's DNA was not impossible. Exhumation was one option, but exhumation required approval, funding, and a legal justification strong enough to sway higher-ups. The other option was familial search, matching the partial profile against living relatives. 40 years ago, that would have been madness. Now, it was standard practice. Paul made several calls, verifying what little he could about Kappen's family. He had a wife once, a son, and possibly a daughter. His son, Paul discovered, was still alive, living quietly in the region. If the son voluntarily provided DNA, it could either eliminate Joseph entirely or point directly to him. It's a big ask, Phil warned. Imagine being told your DNA is needed to see if your father was a serial killer. Paul sighed, but it's the only way. They prepared the approach carefully. No pressure, no accusations. Only the truth. The police were pursuing new leads in the 1973 murders, and DNA technology offered a chance at closure. When they visited the son, his name withheld in official records for privacy, they were met with a cautious, uneasy man in his mid-50s. He had the weary posture of someone who'd carried too many burdens silently. His home was modest, his manners polite but tense. Paul explained the situation plainly. We're revisiting the murders of Geraldine Hughes and Pauline Floyd. We've recovered DNA from evidence. We believe there may be a familial link. You think my father? The man's voice cracked barely above a whisper. We don't know, Paul said gently. We want clarity for the victims, for you. The man stared at the floor for a long time, grappling with a truth he had likely suspected but never wanted confirmed. Finally, with trembling hands, he signed the consent form. Take whatever you need, he said. I don't want to live with questions anymore. The test results took 2 agonizing weeks. When the call finally came, Paul was sitting alone at his desk, reading through another stack of witness statements. The forensic scientist's voice was steady, clinical, but the meaning beneath it was earth-shaking. The DNA on the victim's clothing is a paternal match. The individual responsible is almost certainly the father of the donor. Joseph Kappen. Dead since 1990. But guilty all along. The breath left Paul's lungs as if someone had punched him. Phil, standing nearby, closed his eyes, absorbing the weight of the revelation. After all these years, he murmured, we finally have him. But the story wasn't finished, not yet. Identifying the killer was only the beginning. Understanding his life, his crimes, and why he slipped through the cracks would fill the next chapter of their investigation. And delivering the truth to the families, after half a century of unanswered questions, would be the hardest task of all. The cold case was no longer cold. It was alive, demanding justice. News of the DNA match spread through the small cold case unit like a quiet tremor, passing from one investigator to another, until even those who had only a distant connection to the case paused in silent recognition. It was not celebration. No one felt joy at identifying the man who had murdered 2 innocent girls. It was relief, subdued but powerful, the kind that comes from finally seeing the shape of a monster that had lurked in shadows for 5 decades. But relief did not mean closure. Closure required truth, and truth had layers, evidence, motives, timelines, and consequences. It required confronting the past fully, not just naming the man responsible. Joseph Kappen, bus driver, nighttime prowler, father, husband, killer. Paul sat alone in the dim glow of the cold case room, the single lamp illuminating the old photograph spread across his desk. He studied Kappen's grainy mugshot taken from a minor arrest in the early 1970s. The man's expression was arrogant, lips curled ever so slightly, the look of someone who believed rules were for others. His dark hair hung over a broad forehead, his build stout, ordinary. The kind of man you passed on the street without a second thought. The kind of man teenagers might trust to give them a lift home. That was what haunted Paul most, the ordinariness. Evil often hid in plain sight. Phil entered quietly and placed 2 cups of tea on the table. "You've been staring at that photo for an hour," he said. Paul didn't look up, trying to picture him behind the wheel that night, trying to understand how he walked away from it without a scratch. Phil sighed, lowering himself into the chair. Some people live double lives, family man by day, predator by night. And back then, with no DNA, no CCTV, no computerized records, men like him slipped through. Paul ran a hand over his face. "We need to build the full timeline, where he lived, where he worked, his movements, his patterns. And his past victims," Phil added, "because killers like Kappen don't start with murder. They build toward it." The thought hung in the air, heavy with unspoken dread. They began by visiting the archives to pull every record connected to Kappen: arrests, complaints, employment details, residence history. The files were inconsistent, scattered between departments, some handwritten, some smudged with age, but patterns slowly emerged. Kappen had worked various driving jobs throughout the early 70s, buses, delivery vans, private hires. He was known to drink heavily, especially on weekends. Several women had reported being followed by a man matching his description around that time, though none had been connected to him in the 70s investigation. Most telling was his criminal record: assault charges, harassment, a history of violence toward women, a caution for an attempted sexual assault when he was 22, which had been dismissed due to a terrified victim refusing to testify. That note struck Paul deeply. One woman's fear had allowed a predator to stay free long enough to escalate. While reviewing the file, Phil tapped the page thoughtfully. He was a ticking time bomb. They had him right there. Paul nodded. Different era, different attitudes. Women's complaints weren't treated with the seriousness they deserved. "And 2 girls paid for that with their lives," Phil said, the bitterness in his tone razor sharp. Understanding Kappen's movements in September 1973 became the next priority. They interviewed his surviving relatives, neighbors, even old coworkers who were now elderly and hesitant to revisit memories they'd buried long ago. Some remembered him clearly: a man with sudden temper, often controlling toward his wife, sometimes disappearing for hours without explanation. Others didn't recall much at all. 50 years blurred details, softened edges, erased certainty. One woman, now in her 80s, lived in a quiet cottage overlooking rolling Welsh fields. Her name was Marlene, and she had once worked in the same depot as Kappen. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "He was charming when he wanted to be," she said slowly. "But there was something wrong behind his eyes. He drank too much, argued with everyone, and he watched girls, young girls, in a way that made me uncomfortable." "Do you remember anything specific around September '73? Paul asked. She hesitated, searching her memory. "I remember hearing about the girls. The whole town was shaken, and I remember seeing Joe at work the next day. He looked satisfied. That's the only way I can describe it, like he'd won something." Paul felt a chill. Did anyone suspect him? Oh, some of the men joked about it behind his back, but no one really thought the police would look his way. He was just Joe, angry Joe. Everyone avoided him, but no one imagined he was capable of murder. People rarely imagine it until it's too late. With interviews gathered, timelines sketched, and behavioral patterns taking shape, there remained one final and painful step: telling the families of Geraldine Hughes and Pauline Floyd that their daughter's killer had been identified. It was a moment Paul dreaded more than any other. Families lived entire lifetimes around unanswered questions, and when the truth finally arrived, it carried both relief and agony. The Hughes family lived in a quiet cul-de-sac on the outskirts of Swansea. Geraldine's sister, now in her 60s, opened the door, her eyes already moist. She invited Paul and Phil inside, hands trembling as she made tea she didn't drink. When Paul gently said, "We have identified the man responsible for Geraldine's death," her breath hitched in her throat. She sat back, gripping the edge of the chair as though it were the only thing keeping her grounded. "Who?" she whispered. "A man named Joseph Kappen. He died in 1990. For a long moment she didn't speak, tears welled, spilling freely. All these years, he was gone before we even knew. Paul spoke softly. "We understand this is painful, but you deserve to know, and Geraldine deserves the truth." She nodded, wiping her cheeks. "I always prayed someone would tell us his name before I died. Now I know, thank you." Across town, Pauline's mother, frail, leaning heavily on a cane, listened to the same truth. Her reaction was quieter, almost numb. Grief had worn her down over decades, dulling the sharpness but never erasing the wound. She stared out the window as rain pattered softly. "So he went to his grave without paying for what he did," she said. "Yes," Paul replied, "but the truth has caught up with him now." She closed her eyes. "My Pauline can rest at last." There was no solace in the moment, only the bittersweet resolution of finally knowing. Back at headquarters, the team dove deeper into reconstructing the events of the night. Using modern analytical tools, GPS mapping of 1973 routes, and traffic patterns reconstructed from old municipal records, they traced the likely path Kappen drove after picking up the girls. Witness descriptions suggested he had been driving a light-colored car. Records confirmed he owned a beige Austin 1100 at the time. The likely sequence was chilling. He spotted the girls outside the top rank, offered them a lift, and they accepted, perhaps thinking he was a taxi driver, perhaps trusting the friendliness of a familiar face from the local pub. He drove toward the dual carriageway, but instead of taking them home, diverted to a remote area near Llandarcy. There he assaulted and strangled them, one after the other or possibly both together. Then he dumped their bodies in the woods, wiped down the car, and returned home as if nothing had happened. The level of control and confidence suggested a man who had assaulted before, a man who felt invincible. Phil leaned back after reviewing the reconstructed timeline. He did it quickly, efficiently. He thought it through. It wasn't his first time, Paul agreed, just the first time he killed. To confirm this theory, the team expanded their search to unsolved sexual assaults and attempted attacks in South Wales in the years leading up to 1973. Patterns emerged: women approached by a man in a car, offered lifts, followed or grabbed in poorly lit areas. None had resulted in murder, but the escalation was clear. If Kappen had been properly investigated for earlier offenses, the murders might never have happened. One case stood out: a young woman who in 1972 reported that a man in a beige car attempted to force her inside. She fought him off, ran, and later described him as having dark, angry eyes and a thick build. Her report went nowhere due to lack of evidence. But now, decades later, the description was unmistakably Kappen. Paul stared at the old statement, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. She was his near miss, the one who got away. "And no one connected the dots," Phil said quietly. The tragedy of cold cases was not only the victims lost, but the opportunities missed. The next step was exhumation. Even though the familial DNA match pointed conclusively toward Kappen, confirming it with his own DNA would remove all doubt and ensure the case was airtight historically and legally. After weeks of paperwork, meetings, approvals, and ethical deliberations, the Home Office authorized the exhumation. On a gray morning under the muted light of an overcast sky, forensic specialists gathered at the cemetery where Kappen had been buried. Paul stood at a respectful distance, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. The process was clinical, careful, solemn. The coffin, weathered by decades underground, was lifted slowly. Inside remained only bones, fragile and pale. A swab from the femur provided enough material for DNA extraction. 2 weeks later, the results arrived. It was a perfect match. Joseph Kappen was, without any remaining doubt, the murderer of Geraldine Hughes and Pauline Floyd. Phil lowered the report onto the desk. "That's it. We've got him, fully, officially, scientifically." Paul exhaled. "We name him publicly, properly. After 50 years, the girls finally get justice." But before releasing anything to the public, they needed to understand the man behind the crimes. They spoke to psychologists, criminal behavior experts, historians, and social workers familiar with the era. A clearer image of Kappen emerged, a man deeply insecure, prone to rage, craving control. His drinking fed his volatility. His criminal record showed impulsive violence. His family life was fractured, his marriage plagued by domestic abuse. He sought power over those he perceived as vulnerable, especially young women. The experts agreed. He fit the classic profile of a serial offender whose early crimes, left unchecked, escalated to murder. The 2 confirmed murders might not have been his only ones. Though no evidence conclusively tied him to additional homicides, the possibility lingered. Several missing persons cases from that period were re-examined, but without physical evidence, the truth could never be known. Even so, solving the case of Geraldine and Pauline was monumental. Cold case detectives often retired without breakthroughs. This one had been waiting for half a century. When the press conference was finally held, cameras crowded the room and journalists leaned forward eagerly. Paul stepped to the podium, flanked by Phil and senior officers. The families sat quietly in the front row, holding hands, bracing for the moment the world learned what they had only recently come to accept. Paul spoke clearly, firmly, with the weight of decades behind his voice. Through advanced DNA analysis, the South Wales police have conclusively identified the killer responsible for the 1973 murders of Geraldine Hughes and Pauline Floyd. The perpetrator was Joseph Kappen, who died in 1990. Today, we publicly close the case that has haunted this community for 50 years. Flashbulbs erupted, reporters shouted questions, but all noise faded for a moment when the families bowed their heads, tears running down their cheeks. It wasn't joy, it was release. A breath held for half a lifetime finally exhaled. After the conference, as crowds dispersed and the day settled into a quiet dusk, Paul and Phil stood outside the station watching the clouds drift over Port Talbot's skyline. Smoke no longer billowed from the steelworks. The old industrial heartbeat of the town had slowed to silence, but the truth they uncovered would echo through its streets for years to come. Phil sighed deeply. "It's strange, isn't it, spending so long hunting a man who's already dead?" Paul nodded. "We didn't do it for him, we did it for the girls." "Do you think they'd be proud?" Phil asked. "I hope so," Paul said. "They deserve justice, even if justice came late." Behind them, the cold case room lights flickered off one by one, but the story was far from over. The past still had more to reveal, about how Kappen lived, how he hid, and how close the police had once come to stopping him long before his name was known. And uncovering those final truths would shape the last chapter of their investigation. The final months of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow's run felt different from everything that came before. It was as if the air itself had grown heavy around them, as if every dusty highway and abandoned backroad whispered that time was running out. Their photographs had already been printed in newspapers across the country, their crimes debated in barber shops and breakfast diners, their names turned into symbols. Some saw them as thrilling rebels striking back at a broken system, but law enforcement saw them as violent fugitives responsible for bloodshed across several states. Every lawman from Texas to Missouri wanted them stopped, and every small mistake now felt like it could be the one that killed them. Bonnie's limp had worsened after the car crash months earlier. Burned scars stretched across her leg, leaving her in constant pain. Clyde tried to hide how badly it affected him. He still lifted her into the car some mornings when her leg failed her. But even as her body weakened, Bonnie's loyalty only sharpened. She wrote in her notebook at night, scribbling poems by candlelight about death, loyalty, and the promise she believed she and Clyde had made to each other. They would never be taken alive. Their circle was shrinking. Former gang members drifted away, some out of fear, others because they knew staying meant dying. But Bonnie and Clyde were past the point of escape. The country was changing. Police departments had new cars, new guns, better radios, and officers were sharing information across state lines with a speed criminals couldn't outrun like they used to. Clyde still studied maps with the same determined focus, tracing routes that zigzagged through the Midwest, always searching for new backroads, new safe houses, new towns that hadn't heard his name yet. But the world was closing in. The turning point came when they returned to Texas to visit Henry Methvin's family. Clyde believed helping Henry was a kind of debt. He had broken Henry out of the same brutal East End prison camp Clyde once swore to destroy. But what Clyde didn't know, what would seal their fate, was that Henry's father had struck a deal with law enforcement. If police spared Henry, the Methvins would help deliver Bonnie and Clyde. Meanwhile, Bonnie and Clyde moved in the only way they knew, fast, nervous, and desperate. Nights were never restful. They slept in shifts, always waiting for the crunch of boots outside a motel door or the thud of a rifle stock against a window. Bonnie often woke Clyde when nightmares shook him awake, memories of Eastham, of friends being shot beside him, of blood spreading across the dirt. Bonnie would place a hand over his chest until his breathing slowed. In those small moments, the legend of Bonnie and Clyde fell away, leaving just two exhausted young people who had run too far to turn back. People they once trusted now feared them. Farm families who once offered food slammed their doors. Gas station attendants recognized their faces and silently prayed the pair would leave without starting anything. Newspapers painted Bonnie as a machine gun-wielding killer, even though in reality she had never killed anyone. But when the law wants someone dead, the truth rarely matters. In the spring of 1934, the couple drifted through Louisiana, the place that would become their grave. They stayed in abandoned barns, empty farmhouses, even thickets of trees where they slept with mosquitoes swarming around them. Bonnie's health was fading quicker than she let on. She coughed often, struggled to walk long distances, and the weight loss was visible in her face. Clyde tried to shield her, carrying her when her leg burned too intensely, insisting they stop more often even when it risked their safety. Bonnie teased him for worrying, but the truth was she knew her body wouldn't last much longer. Still, when Clyde planned the killing of Hamer's reputation, using robberies and misleading letters, they both knew it was useless. Frank Hamer, the legendary former Texas Ranger hunting them, wasn't a man who could be tricked with newspaper stories. He was relentless, patient, and too experienced to underestimate the pair. By May 1934, the trap was set. Henry Methvin's father told Hamer exactly where Bonnie and Clyde would be traveling, a quiet stretch of road near Gippsland, Louisiana. The plan was simple: stop the criminals before they reached a rendezvous point. But Bonnie and Clyde believed they were going to help Henry, who they thought was stranded nearby. That belief drove them straight to the spot where at least 6 lawmen waited with rifles pointed. The last sunrise they ever saw was soft and pale, filtering through the trees as Clyde drove the stolen Ford V8 fast, the way he always liked. Bonnie sat beside him, humming a song she remembered from her childhood. She had a sandwich wrapped in wax paper on her lap. Clyde joked that someday they would sit,